The chamber did not feel explosive when the cameras first went live. It felt procedural, predictable. The European Parliament has hosted countless oversight sessions that pass unnoticed beyond policy circles. But this one carried a different charge. Viewership numbers were already climbing before Ursula von der Leyen even entered the hall. Political analysts had signaled that the agenda, officially labeled as Emergency Governance Transparency Review, would touch something deeper than paperwork. She walked in composed. For years, she had managed crises that reshaped Europe's political landscape. Pandemic recovery mechanisms required centralized procurement authority. Energy shock coordination demanded rapid executive action. Sanctions architecture against Russia required speed and unity. Under her leadership, the European Commission had operated at a pace unprecedented in EU history. Speed changes institutions. When crisis strikes, governance accelerates. When governance accelerates, authority consolidates. And when consolidation repeats over multiple crises, structure shifts. The session began calmly. Committee summaries referenced documentation intervals and procedural activation clauses used during emergency frameworks. Von der Leyen defended the Commission's actions as legally grounded and strategically necessary. Europe had faced overlapping crises. Fragmentation would have been catastrophic. Central coordination preserved stability. Then, the screens behind the chamber illuminated with a cumulative timeline. Not a single decision, not one contract. A consolidated map of executive authority activations across 3 major crisis cycles. The effect was immediate. Individually, each activation appeared justified. Collectively, the pattern suggested concentration. Oversight windows had been compressed under emergency clauses. Certain executive discretion thresholds had been triggered repeatedly. Parliamentary review had occurred, but often after implementation rather than before. None of it unlawful. But visibility reframes perception. Members across party lines began referencing the same question. Had temporary acceleration gradually reshaped permanent power balance? Von der Leyen remained steady. She emphasized treaty compliance. She reminded the chamber that speed saved European economies. She reiterated that every measure was documented and reviewable. Her defense was structured. Yet something in the chamber had shifted. The debate moved from specific actions to institutional architecture. Architecture defines power. A procedural motion requested expanded projection of emergency clause language and interpretive scope. The documentation revealed that certain clauses allowed broader discretion under crisis designation than many members had previously internalized. Again, legal, but politically revealing. The atmosphere thickened. It was not shouting. It was intensity, built from recognition. Crisis governance had normalized executive acceleration. Now Parliament was examining the residue. Calls for enhanced oversight review mechanisms multiplied. Members from sovereignty-leaning factions argued that democratic compression was occurring. Even some integration supporters acknowledged that visualizing cumulative authority raised legitimate structural questions. The chair struggled to regulate speaking time as interventions increased. Then came the inflection point. A formal motion was introduced to establish a temporary expanded oversight mechanism, reviewing all crisis-triggered executive consolidations from the previous 3-year cycle. This was not a no-confidence vote. It was a structural audit. Consultations were requested. A brief procedural suspension followed. The cameras did not cut. The pause lasted minutes, but optics amplified it. Commentary across Europe erupted instantly. Headlines framed it as institutional confrontation. Analysts debated whether Brussels was facing its first visible internal power recalibration in years. When the session resumed, equilibrium had shifted. Von der Leyen altered her framing. Instead of defending past actions individually, she broadened the lens. Europe's geopolitical environment remained unstable. Global competition intensified. Energy markets remained volatile. Strategic autonomy required executive agility. Diluting crisis tools could weaken continental resilience. Her argument resonated with many, but the central question would not dissolve. When emergency authority becomes recurrent, how does it revert? The debate extended late into the evening. Oversight sunset clauses were discussed. Reporting intervals were scrutinized. Transparency frameworks were mapped publicly in ways rarely broadcast before. There was no dramatic shouting match, no theatrical collapse, but the exposure was real. Not exposure of wrongdoing, exposure of structural tension. For millions watching live, the moment felt explosive because invisible architecture had been illuminated. Power is most stable when unnoticed. Once noticed, it becomes negotiable. The session concluded without resignation. No formal censure passed. Markets remained stable. The euro did not flinch. Yet the psychological shift was undeniable. The following weeks saw rapid procedural recalibration. Committees expanded documentation access. Reporting intervals were clarified. Crisis activation definitions were refined to prevent interpretive elasticity. Von der Leyen remained in office, but the aura of unchecked acceleration dissolved. Brussels did not collapse. It adjusted. And adjustment in institutional systems is often more consequential than scandal. The deeper narrative was not panic, it was recalibration. Crisis governance had expanded executive tools. Parliamentary visibility reasserted friction. Friction restores equilibrium. Europe did not fracture under exposure. It evolved. The broadcast became a case study in democratic tension under supranational governance, not because a leader fell, but because architecture was forced into the light, and light changes structures. The morning after the broadcast did not bring collapse. It brought recalculation. Newsrooms across Europe replayed the parliamentary session in slow-motion analysis. Commentators froze frames of the cumulative timeline presentation, dissecting the layers of executive activation that had accumulated across crisis cycles. Political talk shows debated whether the European Commission had merely acted efficiently under pressure, or whether a subtle structural drift had occurred. Inside the Parliament building, strategy rooms filled early. Senior advisors reviewed the optics, not the legality. Legality had been intact. Optics had shifted. The most powerful institutions rarely fall because of procedural error. They weaken when perception changes. Ursula von der Leyen understood that the true battlefield was no longer the chamber floor. It was legitimacy. Over years of turbulence, the Commission had evolved into a crisis command center. Rapid vaccine procurement, emergency energy negotiations, joint debt issuance mechanisms. Each required compression of traditional bureaucratic layering. What Parliament exposed was not misconduct, but cumulative acceleration. Acceleration changes gravity inside institutions. The European Union was built as a layered architecture. Commission proposes, Parliament debates, Council negotiates. Crises compressed those layers. Compression centralizes weight. Now, Parliament was demanding decompression. In the days following the hearing, committee chairs initiated formal follow-ups. Documentation release schedules were tightened. Sunset clauses, previously written as broad guidelines, were re-examined for specificity. Emergency triggers were categorized more narrowly to prevent interpretive sprawl. Markets remained calm. That calm mattered. It signaled that investors did not perceive systemic instability. But political legitimacy operates on a different axis than bond spreads. Legitimacy depends on narrative. Across member states, reactions diverged. In Germany, political analysts framed the confrontation as democratic maturity, oversight, working as designed. In France, commentators highlighted the tension between efficiency and accountability. In Italy and parts of Eastern Europe, sovereignty advocates amplified the session as evidence that Brussels must remain answerable. Von der Leyen recalibrated her public tone. She emphasized partnership with Parliament. She welcomed review mechanisms as strengthening European governance. This shift was subtle but strategic. Resistance would have escalated tension. Cooperation diffused it. Behind closed doors, however, deeper strategic questions emerged. Had crisis governance permanently altered the Commission's center of gravity? Could authority revert without weakening Europe's capacity to respond quickly to future shocks? The world had not grown calmer. Energy instability lingered. Geopolitical competition intensified. Climate emergencies loomed. The paradox became clear. The same acceleration that preserved European stability during crises now faced democratic friction. Meanwhile, international observers watched closely. Washington analyzed whether internal EU recalibration might slow policy alignment on trade and sanctions. Moscow studied whether visible parliamentary tension could weaken cohesion. Beijing assessed whether governance friction might create openings for economic engagement. The European Parliament seized the moment to expand its visibility. Members framed the session as proof that supranational governance remains accountable. Public engagement spiked. Viewership metrics revealed unusually high interest in parliamentary procedure. That interest reshaped expectations. When citizens witness institutional tension live, they recalibrate their understanding of power. Within weeks, an expanded oversight task force was formally established. It did not strip executive authority. It refined its guardrails. Emergency activation definitions were codified more narrowly. Reporting intervals shortened. Transparency portals were enhanced for public access. None of these reforms appeared revolutionary in isolation. Together, they signaled recalibration. Von der Leyen's leadership entered a new phase. No longer defined solely by crisis command efficiency, it now required visible institutional balance. That balance strengthened long-term legitimacy, even as it slightly reduced discretionary speed. The European Council quietly supported the recalibration. Member state leaders recognized that sustained executive concentration without visible oversight could erode public trust. Trust sustains integration. Months later, analysts would look back at the broadcast as a hinge moment, not because a leader collapsed, but because architecture adjusted under illumination. Architecture illuminated becomes architecture refined. The European Union did not fracture into panic. It did not descend into scandal. It underwent exposure of cumulative acceleration. Exposure forces evolution. As the next crisis inevitably approached, Europe would respond with slightly different tools. Crisis clauses would be triggered with clearer sunset provisions. Parliamentary reporting would occur in tighter windows. Transparency dashboards would activate automatically. Von der Leyen continued in office, but the aura of unquestioned acceleration had faded. In its place emerged negotiated equilibrium. Equilibrium is not static. It oscillates. The broadcast had marked a shift from compressed governance toward visible accountability. The union's resilience did not derive from silence, but from adjustment, and that adjustment ensured that power inside Brussels remained dynamic rather than rigid. Years later, historians would not describe the moment as panic. They would describe it as friction restored. In democracies, friction is strength. The live session had illuminated structural tension. That tension, once acknowledged, reshaped governance without collapsing it. The story ended not with departure, but with recalibration. And recalibration, though less dramatic than collapse, defines the trajectory of institutions far more profoundly.